Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sleepless Campfire. Tonight, we travel into the vast expanse of the Navajo Nation in Arizona, a land of ancient traditions, sacred mountains, and shadows that move when no one is watching. Within this territory of 27,000 square miles, the Navajo tribal police serve as guardians, facing threats that extend far beyond ordinary criminal activity. Across these red mesas, desert plains, and isolated communities are accounts drawn from official police reports, witness testimonies, and departmental archives, each one verified, documented, and retold in their own words. Stories that challenge our understanding of reality and speak of encounters that defy logical explanation. The Navajo people have long spoken of entities that walk between worlds, skinwalkers who can take animal form, spirits of the deceased who linger near their earthly attachments, and dark forces that emerge when traditional protocols are broken. For the officers tasked with patrolling these lands, such beliefs are not folklore, but daily considerations in the line of duty. What follows are 7 cases from Navajo tribal police files that document encounters with phenomena existing at the intersection of traditional belief and modern law enforcement. These are not campfire tales, but official reports from sworn officers who found themselves facing something beyond their training and experience. Now, let us begin with our first story. In early November of 2014, Officer Daniel Begay had been with the Navajo Tribal Police for just over a year. His regular patrol route covered the remote areas around Window Rock, the tribal capital that sits in the shadow of the distinctive hole-in-the-rock formation for which it was named. The autumn nights had grown increasingly cold, and the high desert air carried the sharp scent of juniper and approaching winter. Begay's shift began at 6 p.m., as usual, with the familiar routine of checking his equipment, logging his patrol vehicle mileage, and receiving his assignment from dispatch. That evening, he was tasked with monitoring the western perimeter of the community, where several families had reported unusual nighttime activity around their properties. The reports had been vague sounds of movement outside homes, unfamiliar tracks in the sand, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. Nothing criminal had occurred, but the persistence of the complaints warranted official attention. The desert landscape transformed as darkness fell. The red rocks of the surrounding cliffs took on deeper hues, eventually becoming silhouettes against a sky filled with more stars than Begay had ever seen growing up in Phoenix. His cruiser's headlights cut narrow paths through the darkness, illuminating dust devils dancing across the asphalt and the occasional jackrabbit frozen in the beam before darting into the brush. The radio crackled intermittently with routine traffic, other officers checking in at various checkpoints, dispatch logging calls about domestic disturbances or traffic violations. Everything seemed normal. At approximately 9:47 p.m., Begay pulled his vehicle to a stop at a designated observation point overlooking a small cluster of homes about 3 miles west of Window Rock. From this elevated position, he could see the faint lights of the houses below and the dark outline of the landscape beyond. He killed his engine, allowing the natural sounds of the desert to fill the silence, the distant howl of a coyote, the whisper of wind through sagebrush, the gentle hum of his own equipment. He scanned the area with binoculars, noting nothing unusual, and was preparing to continue his patrol when he noticed something odd. One of the houses below had a light on in an upper room, but there was something else, a darker shape positioned near the corner of the house, just beyond the reach of the porch light's glow. It appeared to be crouched or hunched over, unnaturally still against the wall. Begay adjusted his binoculars, focusing carefully, but the shape remained indistinct, as if somehow absorbing what little light reached it. He radioed dispatch to report his observation, noting that the figure did not appear to be human in its proportions or stillness. As he watched, the figure began to move, not walking or running, but flowing along the wall with an unnatural smoothness. It stopped beneath the window of the lit room and appeared to tilt its head upward. Bigay felt a cold dread creep up his spine despite the heater running in his cruiser. He had seen many strange things during his year of service, but nothing quite like this. The figure then began to climb the wall itself, moving vertically with an ease that defied gravity, until it reached the window and seemed to press against the glass. Inside the room, Bigay could see a child's silhouette move toward the window, drawn by perhaps the sound or the presence outside. The officer's training and instincts took over. He grabbed his radio and called for immediate backup, while simultaneously starting his cruiser and racing down the hill toward the house. As his vehicle bounced along the dirt road, he kept his eyes locked on the window, watching in horror as the figure seemed to pass through the glass without breaking it. When Bigay arrived at the house, the family was already stirring, awakened by his approaching lights and siren. He burst through the front door to find a young girl standing by the window, pointing and crying. "It wanted me to come with it," she sobbed. It looked like my grandpa, but his eyes were wrong. The parents stood behind her, confusion and fear etched on their faces. The room was undisturbed, the window intact and locked from the inside. Backup arrived within minutes, and officers conducted a thorough search of the property and surrounding area. They found no footprints other than those of the family and responding officers. No signs of forced entry. Nothing to explain what Bigay had witnessed or what the child had experienced. The official report noted the incident as a possible hallucination and unsubstantiated sighting. But Bigay knew what he had seen. In the following weeks, the family requested and received a transfer to housing in a different community. The child spoke less and less of the incident, eventually falling silent about it altogether. Officer Bigay never again saw anything like the figure at the window. But he found himself unconsciously checking upper-story windows during his patrols, especially on cold November nights when the desert air carried unusual sounds across the reservation. The official file remains open, but inactive, categorized under unexplained phenomena. Bigay left the Navajo tribal police 2 years later, citing personal reasons. In his exit interview, when asked about any memorable incidents during his service, he mentioned only the routine calls and traffic violations. The window in Window Rock holds its secret still, watching over the desert with its ancient, patient gaze. It was mid-January of 2016 when Sergeant Maria Yazzie began what should have been a routine night shift. With 15 years of service to the Navajo tribal police, she had developed an almost sixth sense about the rhythms of the community and the land itself. That evening, a winter storm was moving through the region, bringing with it freezing rain and an unusual stillness that seemed to muffle even the most persistent desert sounds. Yazzie's assignment that night was to patrol the northern section of Chinle, near the mouth of Canyon de Chelly. The area was sparsely populated, with only a handful of homes scattered along the dirt roads that wound through the Pinon juniper woodlands. The storm had already knocked out power to several residences, and Yazzie was checking on families when dispatch radioed with a report of a disabled vehicle on the Canyon Rim Road. The report came from a truck driver who had passed the vehicle and noted its lights were still on, but appeared dim. No one had been seen around the car, and given the deteriorating weather conditions, dispatch requested Yazzie investigate. She acknowledged the call at 8:23 p.m., noting the location as approximately 7 miles north of Chinle, near an overlook known as Spider Rock Viewpoint. As Yazzie drove north, the freezing rain intensified, coating her windshield with a thin layer of ice that the wipers struggled to clear. The storm had brought an early darkness to the canyonlands, and the beams of her headlights reflected off the ice-covered road, creating an otherworldly glow. She reduced her speed, navigating carefully through the treacherous conditions, her cruiser's tires finding limited traction on the slick surface. At approximately 8:49 p.m., Yazzie spotted the disabled vehicle ahead. It was a late-model sedan, angled partially off the road with its headlights pointing toward the canyon. The lights were indeed dim, flickering intermittently as if the battery was failing. As she approached, Yazzie noted that there were no tracks leading away from the vehicle, and no signs of a collision or mechanical failure beyond what might have caused it to stop. Yazzie radioed her arrival to dispatch, noting the vehicle's description and license plate. The response came back with information about the registered owner, a 34-year-old woman from Kayenta, who had been reported missing by her family that afternoon when she failed to arrive for a scheduled visit. A chill ran down Yazzie's spine as she realized the significance of this discovery. Exiting her cruiser, Yazzie approached the vehicle cautiously, her hand resting on the sidearm at her hip. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, and as she drew closer, she could see that the interior light was on, casting a weak yellow glow. Peering inside, she found the car empty. But with several personal items scattered across the seats, a woman's purse, a cell phone with a cracked screen, and a child's car seat in the back. What struck Yazzie as particularly odd was the temperature inside the vehicle. Despite the freezing rain outside, the car's interior felt unusually cold, as if something had drawn all warmth from the space. Her breath formed visible clouds in the air, and she noticed a thin layer of ice forming on the dashboard near the windshield. Yazzie called for backup and a search team, then began to document the scene with photographs and detailed notes. As she worked, she became aware of a sound that seemed to come from the canyon below, a high-pitched humming or whining that vibrated through the soles of her boots. The sound was intermittent, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, like some form of communication. When backup arrived approximately 20 minutes later, the first responding officer commented immediately on the unusual cold emanating from the vehicle. Both officers noted that the humming sound had ceased, replaced by an unnatural silence that seemed heavier than mere absence of noise. The search team that arrived shortly thereafter found no tracks leading away from the vehicle, despite the muddy ground that should have preserved footprints clearly. The investigation continued throughout the night and into the following days. Search parties combed the canyon rim and descended into the canyon itself, but found no sign of the missing woman. The vehicle was processed for evidence, but yielded only the normal fingerprints of the owner and her family. The cell phone was damaged beyond repair, with no retrievable data. What remained unexplained was the profound cold that had permeated the vehicle, a temperature discrepancy that defied logical explanation given the ambient weather conditions. Several officers who had responded to the scene independently reported the same phenomenon in their official statements, though the official report made no mention of it, focusing instead on the routine aspects of the investigation. 3 weeks later, the vehicle was released to the family, who sold it to a salvage yard in Flagstaff. The missing woman was never found, and the case remains open in the Navajo tribal police files. Sergeant Yazzie retired the following year, moving to Phoenix to be closer to her grandchildren. In a conversation with a former colleague, she mentioned that she could never again stand near the edge of Canyon de Chelly without feeling that same profound cold and hearing the echo of a sound that existed somewhere between hearing and memory. In late March of 2018, Officer Thomas Nez was completing his final month before retirement from the Navajo Tribal Police. After 22 years of service, most of it in the Kayenta district, he thought he had seen everything the reservation could present in terms of unusual occurrences. He had responded to reports of witchcraft, dealt with disturbances attributed to skinwalkers, and followed countless trails that led nowhere in the vast desert landscape. Nothing prepared him for what he would encounter during his final week of duty. The evening began like any other spring night in Kayenta. Nez reported for his 4 p.m. shift, received his assignment, and conducted the usual equipment check. His patrol that night would cover the western section of the community, an area of scattered homes and small businesses that stretched toward the base of the Monument Valley formations. The weather was mild, with a slight breeze carrying the scent of desert blooms after recent rains. At approximately 7:15 p.m., Nez received a call from dispatch regarding a disturbance at a convenience store on the western edge of town. The caller, the store's owner, reported that someone had been trying the doors and windows after closing time, though when he went to investigate, he found no one. The request was for a routine patrol check to ensure the premises were secure. Nez arrived at the store at 7:28 p.m., finding it exactly as the owner had described, locked up for the night, with no signs of attempted entry or damage. He circled the building, flashlight beam cutting through the growing darkness, noting nothing unusual. As he rounded the corner to the back of the store, however, he stopped short. Standing near the dumpster were 3 figures, dark and indistinct in the fading light. They appeared to be humanoid in shape, but taller than average, with proportions that seemed somehow wrong. What disturbed Nez most was their stillness. They stood absolutely motionless, facing away from him toward the desert beyond the store's parking lot. Nez called out, identifying himself as a police officer and instructing the figures to turn around and show their hands. They remained motionless. He repeated his command, this time with more authority, his hand moving to the radio at his shoulder. Still no response. Drawing his flashlight, Nez pointed the beam directly at the figures, expecting the bright light to elicit some reaction. What happened next would stay with Nez for the rest of his life. As the flashlight beam illuminated the figures, they did not reflect light as normal objects or people would. Instead, they seemed to absorb the light, becoming darker, more defined, yet somehow less substantial. Then, without turning, without any discernible movement, they began to recede from the light, moving backward toward the desert while still facing away. Nez radioed for backup, reporting suspicious individuals behind the convenience store. As he spoke, he watched in disbelief as the figures continued their strange backward movement, never turning, never changing their relative positions to one another. They moved with an unnatural smoothness, not walking but gliding across the ground, their feet seemingly making no contact with the earth. When backup arrived 5 minutes later, the figures had reached the edge of the parking lot where it met the open desert. The responding officers, both younger than Nez and less experienced, stared in disbelief as the 3 shapes continued their backward retreat into the darkness. One officer started to move forward as if to give chase, but Nez held up his hand, signaling him to stop. "There's something wrong here," Nez said quietly, his voice barely audible above the desert wind. "Watch." As the 3 figures reached the boundary between the parking lot and the desert, they did not continue into the open terrain as expected. Instead, they began to dissolve or dissipate, their forms becoming less distinct, breaking apart like smoke in a breeze until nothing remained but the empty desert landscape. The entire process took perhaps 10 seconds, leaving the 3 officers standing in stunned silence. The incident was documented in an official report, which described the figures as unidentified individuals of unusual height and proportions, who retreated into the desert darkness. The report made no mention of their backward movement, their absorption of light, or their strange dissolution at the desert's edge. To do so would have invited questions that had no answers within the framework of standard police procedure. In the days that followed, Nez found himself increasingly preoccupied with the encounter. He reviewed security camera footage from the convenience store, but found nothing. The camera's view of the area where the figures had stood was inexplicably blurred during the time of the incident, though it functioned normally before and after. He spoke with the store owner, who mentioned that this wasn't the first time he had felt a presence around his business after dark, though he had never seen anything so clearly before. Nez retired as scheduled at the end of March 2018. His retirement party was a typical law enforcement gathering, with stories told, gifts exchanged, and congratulations offered. When the department chief asked if Nez had any final words of wisdom for the younger officers, he paused for a long moment before speaking. "There are things out there that we're not trained to handle," he said quietly. "Sometimes the best response is to watch, to remember, and to know when not to engage." No one quite understood what he meant, though several of the older officers nodded in recognition of some unspoken truth. The official file regarding the incident at the Cayenta convenience store remains open but inactive, categorized as unidentified persons, no criminal activity detected. Nez moved to Tucson after retirement, where he lives with his daughter's family. On quiet nights, he sometimes stands in his backyard, facing west toward the vast desert that holds so many secrets, wondering about the nature of the shadow figures and the meaning of their backward dance into darkness. In late August of 2015, Officer Joseph Charlie was assigned to a special detail monitoring the areas around Shiprock. The iconic 1,483-foot volcanic formation that dominates the landscape in northwestern New Mexico near the Arizona border. The formation holds profound significance in Navajo tradition, considered sacred and associated with various legends and spiritual beliefs. Charlie, a member of the Navajo Nation himself, approached this assignment with particular reverence and caution. The detail had been requested following several reports of unusual activity in the area, including unauthorized climbs to the summit, strictly prohibited by tribal ordinance, and strange lights observed near the peak after dark. Charlie's task was to monitor access points and educate visitors about the cultural significance of the site while enforcing the regulations protecting it. The evening of August 17th began unremarkably. Charlie reported to his post at 6 p.m. as the desert heat began to give way to the cooler temperatures of twilight. He spent the first hours of his shift checking vehicles parked near the formation and speaking with a few photographers who were capturing the last light of day on the rock's distinctive profile. As darkness fell, the area grew quiet, with only the occasional sound of distant traffic on Highway 491. At approximately 9:30 p.m., Charlie noticed a faint light near the summit of Shiprock. At first, he assumed it might be a reflection or perhaps an aircraft in the distance. But as he continued to observe, the light remained fixed in position relative to the formation. Concerned that someone might be making an unauthorized climb, Charlie notified dispatch of his observation and began to drive toward the base of the formation. As Charlie approached, he could see that the light was indeed coming from near the summit, perhaps 100 feet below the peak. It moved slowly, sometimes disappearing behind rock outcroppings before reappearing in a different position. There was no sound accompanying the movement, no voices, no equipment noises, none of the sounds one would expect from someone climbing the formation. Charlie parked his vehicle and grabbed his flashlight, directing the powerful beam toward the summit. The light he had been observing suddenly went out, leaving the formation in darkness. He scanned the rock face with his flashlight, looking for any sign of movement or the reflection of equipment, but found nothing. The night air was still and silent. For the next 20 minutes, Charlie remained at the base of Shiprock, periodically scanning the formation with his flashlight and binoculars. He was about to conclude that whoever had been on the rock had either descended on the opposite side or had found a place to shelter for the night when he noticed something that made the hair on his arms stand up. Near the base of the formation, perhaps 200 feet from his position, a figure emerged from behind a rock outcropping. It appeared to be humanoid in shape, but moved with an odd, disjointed motion that seemed both fluid and unnatural at the same time. Charlie called out, identifying himself as a police officer and instructing the person to remain where they were. The figure stopped, turning slowly to face Charlie. In the dim light from Charlie's flashlight, he could see that it was not a human being, as he understood the term. The figure was tall and thin, with elongated limbs and a head that seemed disproportionately large for its body. Its skin appeared to have a grayish cast, and its eyes reflected the flashlight beam with a red glow that seemed to emanate from within, rather than simply reflecting light. Charlie felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with a desert night. He had heard stories about such encounters from his grandparents, tales of beings that existed between the human world and the spirit realm. But he had always considered them folklore rather than reality. Now, faced with something that defied logical explanation, he found himself struggling to maintain his professional composure. The figure remained motionless for perhaps 30 seconds, its red eyes fixed on Charlie. Then, without warning, it turned and moved toward the rock face with impossible speed, not running but gliding across the ground. Before Charlie could react, it began to ascend the vertical face of shiprock, moving upward with an ease that defied gravity and human capability. Charlie radioed dispatch, reporting what he had witnessed in as objective terms as possible. He described an unidentified individual with unusual climbing abilities moving up the formation. The dispatcher, familiar with the cultural significance of shiprock and the various legends associated with it, responded with understanding rather than skepticism. "Be careful out there, Joe," the dispatcher said. "Some places hold memories we're not meant to disturb. Document what you saw and then secure the area. No need to pursue." Charlie followed this advice, documenting the encounter in his notebook and taking photographs of the area where the figure had been. He found no footprints or other physical evidence of the being's presence, though the ground was soft enough that such evidence should have been visible. The only unusual detail was a series of strange markings on the rock face, where the figure had begun its ascent symbols that resembled neither natural formations nor any known human graffiti. The official report filed the next day described an unidentified trespasser with exceptional climbing abilities and noted the unusual symbols found at the base of the formation. The report made no mention of the figure's appearance or its impossible ascent, knowing that such details would likely result in dismissal rather than investigation. In the years that followed, Charlie occasionally found himself assigned to duties near shiprock. He never again encountered anything like the figure he had witnessed that August night, though he sometimes heard reports from other officers or community members about strange lights and unusual occurrences near the formation. Each time, he would remember the red eyes that had looked at him from the darkness and the impossible ascent up the vertical rock face. Now retired from the Navajo tribal police, Charlie sometimes serves as a cultural consultant for law enforcement agencies unfamiliar with Navajo traditions and beliefs. When asked about unusual phenomena on the reservation, he often speaks of the need for respect and caution when dealing with things that exist beyond ordinary understanding. "There are places where the veil between worlds is thin," he tells younger officers. "Shiprock is one of those places. Sometimes the best response is to observe, to document, and to know when to leave things undisturbed." The wisdom of these words has been confirmed by experience, though the full nature of what Charlie witnessed that night remains as mysterious as the ancient formation that dominates the desert landscape. It was early April of 2017 when Officer Rebecca Tso was assigned to investigate a missing person case in the community of Page, near the Arizona-Utah border. The missing individual was a 28-year-old Navajo woman who had last been seen leaving her workplace at a local hotel 3 days earlier. What made this case particularly unusual was the series of strange events that had occurred in the vicinity of the woman's disappearance. Events that suggested something beyond a conventional missing person investigation. So, a 10-year veteran of the Navajo Tribal Police, had handled numerous missing person cases throughout her career. Most followed predictable patterns, people leaving voluntarily to stay with relatives or friends, misunderstandings about planned trips, or, in the more tragic cases, accidents or foul play. This case, however, would challenge her experience and push the boundaries of her understanding of what was possible in the vast desert landscape. The investigation began with interviews with the woman's co-workers and family members. All described her as responsible and reliable, not the type to disappear without notice. She had been scheduled to work the morning shift at the hotel on the day of her disappearance, but had never arrived. Her vehicle was found parked in the hotel's employee lot, locked and undamaged, with her purse and phone inside. The only unusual detail was that the driver's side window was partially open, despite the unseasonably cold weather that had moved through the area the previous night. As Tso began to piece together the woman's last known movements, she discovered several disturbing details. Security footage from the hotel showed the woman leaving at the end of her shift the previous evening, walking to her car as usual. The footage, however, had an unusual glitch at the precise moment she reached her vehicle, a brief period of static and distortion that obscured what happened next. When the image cleared, her car was pulling out of the parking space, though the driver was not clearly visible. The hotel's night manager reported hearing unusual sounds in the parking lot around 2:30 a.m., what she described as whispering voices that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. When she went to investigate, she found nothing unusual, though she noted that the parking lot felt unusually cold for the time of year. She also mentioned that the security system had malfunctioned briefly during that time, though it was working normally before and after. Perhaps most disturbing was the testimony of a guest who had been staying on the second floor of the hotel, directly above the parking lot. The guest, a businessman from Phoenix, reported being awakened around 3 a.m. by a strange light that filled his room. When he looked out the window, he saw what appeared to be multiple figures gathered around the missing woman's car. He described them as tall and thin, almost like shadows given form, moving with an unnatural stillness that was more frightening than any overt threat. When he blinked, they were gone, leaving only the empty parking lot bathed in normal moonlight. As Tso continued her investigation, she discovered that similar unusual occurrences had been reported in the area over the preceding weeks. Several residents had reported strange lights in the sky near the Glen Canyon Dam. Others had heard unusual sounds, whispering voices, high-pitched humming, or the sound of movement when nothing was visible. Most disturbingly, 2 other people had been reported missing in the general area. Though these cases had been attributed to accidents or voluntary disappearances without thorough investigation, Tso decided to expand her search beyond the immediate vicinity of the hotel, examining the areas around Lake Powell and the Glen Canyon Dam. The landscape was rugged and beautiful, with red rock formations that rose dramatically from the blue water of the lake. As she drove along the winding roads that hugged the shoreline, Tso couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, though each time she checked her mirrors, she found only empty highway behind her. At approximately 11:30 a.m., Tso pulled into a scenic overlook that offered a view of the dam and the surrounding canyon. As she stepped out of her vehicle, she noticed something unusual near the edge of the overlook, a series of strange symbols drawn in the sand. similar to those she had seen in reports of other unusual incidents. She photographed the symbols, noting their precise geometric patterns and the way they seemed to form a larger design when viewed from a particular angle. As Tso was photographing the symbols, she became aware of a low humming sound that seemed to come from the direction of the dam. The sound was not the mechanical noise of the dam's operations, but something more organic, almost like a chorus of voices speaking in unison in a language she couldn't understand. The sound seemed to vibrate through the soles of her boots, creating a sensation that was both auditory and physical. Tso followed the sound toward a trail that descended from the overlook toward the lake. As she progressed down the trail, the humming grew louder, and she began to notice other unusual phenomena. The air grew strangely cold despite the warming morning sun, and the normal desert sounds of birds and insects faded into an unnatural silence. The landscape around her seemed to shimmer occasionally, as if viewed through heat distortion, though the morning was cool. After perhaps 10 minutes of walking, Tso arrived at a small cove that was hidden from the main trail. The humming sound was now quite loud, and she could see that it seemed to emanate from the center of the cove, where the air appeared to distort and ripple as if heated, though again, the morning was cool. As she watched, the distortion intensified, forming what appeared to be a vertical shimmering line, like a heat mirage turned sideways. Tso felt a combination of fear and fascination as she observed the phenomenon. She had seen many strange things during her years with the Navajo tribal police, but nothing quite like this. As she watched, the shimmering line seemed to widen, revealing what appeared to be a different landscape on the other side, not the familiar red rocks and blue water of Lake Powell, but something else, something that seemed to exist in shades of gray and silver. Before Tso could process what she was seeing, she heard a sound behind her, the movement of rocks on the trail. Turning quickly, she saw 3 figures moving toward her, similar in appearance to those described by the hotel guest. They were tall and thin, with elongated limbs and no discernible facial features in the bright morning light. They moved with an odd, gliding motion that covered ground quickly, yet made no sound. Tso's training took over, and she reached for her sidearm while simultaneously calling for backup on her radio. The response was only static, the same interference that had affected the hotel's security system. As she backed away from the approaching figures, she noticed something that chilled her to the bone, the missing woman standing among them, her expression blank and her movements as unnatural as those of her companions. The figures continued their approach, and Tso found herself backing toward the shimmering distortion in the center of the cove. As she drew closer to it, she could feel a strange pull, as if the air itself was drawing her toward the opening. The humming sound intensified, and she began to feel disoriented, as if the boundaries between herself and the surrounding environment were dissolving. Just as the figures reached her, Tso's radio suddenly came to life with the voice of the dispatcher, calling her name and asking for her status. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had been cast over the cove, and the figures stopped their approach. The shimmering distortion began to collapse, folding in on itself until it disappeared with a sound like rushing wind. The figures, including the missing woman, dissolved into shadows that were absorbed by the bright morning light. Tso stood alone in the cove, her heart racing and her mind struggling to process what she had just experienced. When backup arrived 5 minutes later, they found only Tso and the strange symbols drawn in the sand. The missing woman was nowhere to be found, and there was no evidence that anyone else had been in the cove recently. The official report described a possible abduction and noted the unusual symbols found at the scene. It made no mention of the shimmering distortion, the figures, or the brief appearance of the missing woman. To include such details would have invited questions that had no answers within the framework of conventional law enforcement. The case remains open in the Navajo tribal police files, categorized as missing person, circumstances unknown. The woman was never seen again, and her family eventually held a memorial service, accepting that they might never know what had happened to her. So continued her service with the department, though she found herself increasingly drawn to cases that involved unusual phenomena, as if seeking understanding of what she had experienced in that hidden cove near Lake Powell. In early October of 2013, Officer Michael Begay was assigned to patrol the areas around Ganado, a small community nestled in the southern part of the Navajo Nation. The town, with its historic trading post established in 1882, served as a cultural crossroads where traditional Navajo ways met the modern world. Begay had grown up in the area, his family tracing their lineage back generations in this region of red mesas and juniper-dotted hills. He knew every dirt road, every arroyo, every landmark that held significance in Navajo tradition. Yet even his extensive local knowledge and cultural understanding couldn't prepare him for what he would encounter during what should have been a routine night shift. A night that would challenge his perception of the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds. The evening began normally enough. Begay reported for duty at 6 p.m., his uniform crisp despite the day's dust, his mind already mapping out the route he would take through the community. He received his assignment from dispatch, noting the familiar names and locations that dotted his patrol area. His duties that night would focus primarily on the residential areas on the eastern outskirts of Ganado, where several families had reported unusual disturbances over the past week. These reports spoke of sounds of movement outside their homes during the night, unfamiliar tracks appearing in the dirt each morning, and the persistent, unsettling feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Nothing criminal had occurred. No property had been damaged or stolen. But the persistence and consistency of the complaints warranted official attention. Begay understood the significance of such reports in a community where the line between the physical and spiritual worlds was traditionally understood to be thin. In Navajo tradition, unexplained phenomena could carry profound meaning. Warnings of imbalance, signs of spiritual disturbance, or evidence that proper protocols had been violated. As he prepared his patrol vehicle, checking his equipment and logging his mileage, Begay considered the possibility that what he was investigating might fall outside the boundaries of conventional law enforcement. The crescent moon that hung above the horizon as he pulled out of the station parking lot seemed to watch him with an ancient, knowing gaze. The first few hours of Begay's shift were uneventful, marked by the routine responsibilities that formed the backbone of police work in rural communities. He drove the familiar roads, his cruiser's headlights cutting narrow paths through the growing darkness, checking on the families who had reported disturbances and finding nothing unusual during his visits. The autumn night was cool and clear, with the scent of juniper and sagebrush carried on a gentle breeze. The normal desert sounds, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small animals in the brush, the whisper of wind through the cottonwood leaves, created a soothing backdrop to his patrol, a reminder of the natural rhythms that had governed this land for millennia. At each home he visited, Begay listened carefully to the residents' accounts, noting the similarities in their experiences. Mrs. Nez, an elderly woman who had lived in the area her entire life, spoke of hearing voices in a language she didn't recognize, though the words seemed to carry an emotional weight that troubled her spirit. The Yazzie family, with 3 young children, described finding strange symbols drawn in the dirt each morning, symbols that would disappear by midday as if they had never existed. A young couple new to the area reported the sensation of movement just beyond the edge of their vision. Shadows that seemed to detach themselves from the natural darkness and move with purpose. each family spoke of a growing sense of unease, a feeling that the normal protective boundaries of their homes had been somehow compromised. At approximately 9:45 p.m., Begay received a call from dispatch regarding a disturbance at a vacant house on the eastern edge of Ganado. The caller, a neighbor named Esther Tso, reported hearing what sounded like whispering voices coming from the property, which had been empty for several months following the death of its elderly owner. Mrs. Tso's voice on the radio carried a note of urgency that went beyond typical concerns about vacant properties. She mentioned that the voices seemed to speak in the ancient dialect associated with traditional ceremonies. Though the words were indistinct and carried an unsettling quality that didn't align with the healing purpose of such rituals. The request was for a routine check to ensure the property was secure, though the dispatcher's tone suggested an understanding that this might be anything but routine. Begay arrived at the property at 10:02 p.m., his cruiser crunching along the gravel driveway that led to the small single-story house. The structure stood exactly as he expected, a modest dwelling with a covered porch, surrounded by a fence that showed signs of disrepair, with several sections leaning precariously. The windows were dark, and there were no visible signs of forced entry or damage. As he approached the front gate, however, he noticed something unusual that made him pause. A series of strange symbols drawn in the dirt near the entrance, similar to those described by the families he had visited earlier, but more complex and deliberate in their execution. These symbols matched those he had seen in reports of other unusual incidents across the reservation, incidents that often defied conventional explanation. The symbols appeared to form a protective circle around the property, though their design didn't align with any traditional blessing patterns Begay recognized from his cultural education. They seemed instead to represent a containment or binding, their angular shapes and intersecting lines creating a sense of restriction rather than welcome. As Begay knelt to examine them more closely, he became aware of a faint sound that seemed to come from the house itself. A whispering or murmuring that was too low to be understood, but too distinct to be dismissed as the wind. The sound seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, as if the very structure of the house was producing the noise, its wooden frame and plaster walls serving as conduits for something that existed beyond normal human perception. Begay called out, identifying himself as a police officer and announcing his presence on the property. The whispering sound continued unchanged, neither increasing nor decreasing in response to his voice. Drawing his flashlight, he approached the front door, finding it locked but with a series of additional symbols drawn on its surface, symbols that seemed to form a pattern when viewed from a particular angle, their lines intersecting in ways that created optical illusions of movement and depth. These symbols were more intricate than those in the dirt, suggesting a more deliberate and knowledgeable hand had created them, someone who understood the spiritual significance of such markings in Navajo tradition. After notifying dispatch of his observations, Begay decided to check the perimeter of the property before attempting to gain entry. As he walked around the house, he noticed that the whispering sound seemed to follow him, always appearing to come from whatever wall was closest to his position. The air around the house felt unusually cold, and his breath formed visible clouds despite the mild autumn temperature. This localized cold spot was a phenomenon Begay had encountered before in cases involving spiritual disturbances, though typically such areas were associated with specific locations rather than moving to follow an observer. When Begay reached the back of the property, he found something that made him pause, a series of footprints in the dirt that appeared to lead to the back wall of the house and then simply stop, as if the person who made them had walked directly into the structure. The footprints were unusual in their appearance, long and narrow, with a depth that suggested a weight greater than a normal human being despite their slender shape. They showed no signs of the scuffing or irregularity typical of normal human movement, instead appearing as precise impressions made with consistent pressure and spacing. Most disturbingly, there were no corresponding prints leading away from the house, suggesting that whatever had made them had either not left or had departed by some other means. As Bugay was examining the footprints, he became aware of a change in the whispering sound. It seemed to intensify, taking on a more distinct quality that almost resembled words in a language he couldn't quite understand, despite his familiarity with various Navajo dialects. The sound seemed to vibrate through the soles of his boots, creating a sensation that was both auditory and physical, as if the ground itself was speaking to him. The temperature continued to drop, and Begay found himself shivering despite his experience with desert nights that often grew cold. This cold felt different. It seemed to emanate from within rather than respond to the external temperature, a spiritual chill that spoke of presence rather than the absence of heat. Begay decided to enter the house, using the spare key that was kept in a lockbox near the back door. A common practice in rural communities where neighbors might need to check on each other's properties. As he turned the key in the lock, he felt a strange resistance, as if something on the other side was holding the door closed. With additional effort, the door finally opened, revealing a dark interior that felt strangely cold and still. The air that emerged from the house carried a scent that Begay couldn't quite identify, something like ozone after a lightning strike, mixed with the sweet smell of decaying leaves, and something else, something ancient and unsettling that reminded him of ceremonial spaces that had been unused for many years. The inside of the house was undisturbed, with furniture covered by dust sheets and a layer of dust on the floor that showed no signs of recent entry. The whispering sound, however, was now much louder, seeming to come from the walls themselves. As Begay moved through the house, he noticed that the sound seemed to emanate from specific points on the walls, where the plaster appeared to have a strange shimmering quality, almost like heat distortion on a cool day. These areas of distortion seemed to pulse in rhythm with the whispering, as if the walls themselves were breathing with the voices they contained. In the main bedroom, Begay found something particularly disturbing. A series of symbols drawn on the wall above the bed, similar to those he had seen outside, but arranged in a complex circular pattern that seemed to represent some form of spiritual diagram or map. The symbols seemed to pulse with a faint light that was barely visible in the beam of his flashlight, their illumination coming from within rather than reflecting his light source. As he approached the wall to examine them more closely, he felt a strange pulling sensation, as if the air itself was drawing him toward the symbols, inviting him to step beyond the normal boundaries of perception and understanding. Begay backed away from the wall, his training and instincts warning him that something was fundamentally wrong with the situation. The traditional knowledge passed down through his family had taught him that certain spiritual phenomena required respect and distance, rather than direct engagement. As he retreated from the room, he became aware of movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that seemed to detach themselves from the corners of the room and move independently. When he turned to look directly at them, they resolved into normal shadows cast by his flashlight. But the impression of movement remained, creating a disorienting sense that the room was filled with presences he could perceive only indirectly. The whispering sound suddenly intensified, becoming almost deafening. Begay felt disoriented, as if the boundaries between himself and the surrounding environment were dissolving. The walls of the room seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that matched the whispering sound. He felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. This was a primal fear that spoke of threats beyond ordinary human understanding, of forces that operated according to principles that existed outside the normal laws of physics and nature. In that moment, Begay understood that he was in the presence of something that transcended his experience and training, something that demanded a response beyond conventional law enforcement procedures. Just as Begay felt himself losing touch with reality, his radio suddenly came to life with the voice of the dispatcher, calling his name and asking for his status. The sound seemed to break whatever influence had been exerted by the house, and the whispering sound immediately ceased. The walls returned to their normal appearance, and the strange symbols on the bedroom wall faded until they were barely visible. The temperature in the room began to normalize, and the feeling of being watched gradually dissipated, leaving Begay alone in the quiet house with only the sound of his own breathing and the distant call of a night bird. Begay quickly exited the house, locking the door behind him and taking several deep breaths of the cool night air. The normalcy of the outside world, the familiar stars in the clear sky, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant lights of Ganado, served as an anchor to reality, helping him re-establish the boundaries that had begun to blur during his time inside the house. When backup arrived 10 minutes later, they found only Begay and the strange symbols drawn in the dirt outside the house. The interior of the house appeared normal, with no signs of the phenomena Begay had experienced, though both responding officers noted an unusual cold spot in the main bedroom that defied explanation given the mild outdoor temperature. The official report Begay filed the next day described unusual symbols and unexplained sounds at the vacant property. It made no mention of the whispering walls, the moving shadows, or the strange symbols that had appeared on the bedroom wall. To include such details would have invited questions that had no answers within the framework of conventional law enforcement, potentially compromising Begay's credibility as an officer while providing no actionable information for further investigation. Instead, he documented only what could be objectively observed and measured, leaving the subjective elements of his experience for private reflection and discussion with those who might understand their significance without requiring conventional proof. The property was secured, and the family of the deceased owner was notified of the incident. They decided to sell the house rather than deal with the disturbances, and it was purchased by a family from outside the area who renovated it extensively before moving in. Begay occasionally drove past the property during his patrols, noting that the strange symbols no longer appeared in the dirt outside and that the house seemed to have settled into a normal existence. Whatever had disturbed its energies apparently having moved on or been dissipated by the renovations. The families in the surrounding area reported no further disturbances, their sense of security gradually returning as the autumn progressed into winter. The official file regarding the incident at the Ganado property remains open but inactive, categorized as unexplained phenomena. Begay continued his service with the Navajo tribal police, though he found himself increasingly aware of the subtle boundaries between the ordinary world and the strange forces that sometimes moved just beyond the edge of human perception. He began studying traditional teachings more seriously, seeking to understand the phenomena he had experienced within the context of Navajo spiritual knowledge rather than dismissing it as inexplicable or attempting to force it into conventional categories. On quiet autumn nights, he sometimes found himself listening for the sound of whispering walls, wondering about the nature of the forces that had briefly made themselves known in that small house in Ganado, and about his role as an officer caught between two worlds: the world of conventional law enforcement and the world of spiritual realities that existed beyond its reach. In late May of 2019, Officer Rachel Lee was assigned to a special detail monitoring the areas around Monument Valley, the iconic landscape on the Arizona-Utah border, known for its dramatic sandstone buttes and profound cultural significance to the Navajo people. Lee had transferred to the Navajo Tribal Police from a suburban department in California 2 years earlier, seeking a deeper connection to her Navajo heritage. Though nothing in her previous experience had prepared her for what she would encounter in the vast desert landscape. The detail had been requested following several reports of unusual activity in the area. including unauthorized visitors to restricted areas and strange lights observed near the buttes after dark. Lee's task was to monitor access points and educate visitors about the cultural significance of the area while enforcing the regulations protecting it. The evening of May 22nd began with a spectacular sunset that painted the sandstone formations in shades of red, orange, and purple. Lee reported to her post at 6 p.m. as the day's last light faded and the desert began to cool. She spent the first hours of her shift checking vehicles parked at various viewpoints and speaking with a few photographers who were capturing the last light of day on the iconic landscape. As darkness fell, the area grew quiet, with only the occasional sound of distant traffic on Highway 163. At approximately 10:15 p.m., Lee received a call from dispatch regarding a vehicle that had been reported abandoned near the West Mitten Butte overlook. The caller, a park ranger who was finishing his shift, noted that the vehicle had been there for several hours and that its owner had not returned. The request was for Lee to check on the situation and ensure the individual's safety. Lee arrived at the overlook at 10:32 p.m., finding a late-model SUV parked with its driver's side door slightly ajar and the interior light on. As she approached, she called out, identifying herself as a police officer, but received no response. A quick search of the immediate area revealed no sign of the vehicle's owner, though Lee did notice a series of unusual tracks in the sand tracks that appeared to lead away from the vehicle toward the base of the West Mitten Butte before simply disappearing. After notifying dispatch of her observations, Lee decided to follow the tracks, using her powerful flashlight to illuminate the path. The tracks were unusual in their appearance, long and narrow, with a depth that suggested a weight greater than a normal human being despite their slender shape. They also showed an unusual pattern of movement, with consistent spacing that suggested a steady, deliberate pace rather than the varied rhythm of normal walking. As Lee followed the tracks into the desert, she became aware of a strange phenomenon. The air around her seemed to shimmer occasionally, as if viewed through heat distortion, though the evening was cool. The normal desert sounds of insects and night birds faded into an unnatural silence, replaced by a low humming sound that seemed to come from the direction of the butte itself. After perhaps 10 minutes of walking, Lee arrived at the base of the West Mitten Butte, where the tracks simply ended. There was no sign of where the person who made them might have gone, no evidence of climbing, no cave or crevice, nothing that would explain the sudden disappearance of the tracks. The humming sound was now quite distinct, seeming to emanate from the rock face itself. As Lee scanned the area with her flashlight, she noticed something unusual on the surface of the butte, a series of strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint light that was barely visible in the beam of her flashlight. The symbols appeared to form a complex pattern that covered a section of the rock face approximately 10 feet high and 20 feet wide. Lee called for backup, reporting her observations and requesting assistance in searching the area. As she waited for backup to arrive, she continued to examine the symbols, noting their precise geometric patterns and the way they seemed to form a larger design when viewed from a particular angle. She also noticed that the humming sound seemed to intensify when she stood directly in front of the symbols, as if responding to her presence. What happened next would challenge Lee's understanding of reality and leave her with questions that would persist for years. As she stood before the symbols, the rock face behind them began to shimmer and distort, similar to a heat mirage, but in the cool night air. The distortion intensified, forming what appeared to be a vertical opening in the solid rock, revealing what appeared to be a different landscape on the other side, not the familiar desert of Monument Valley, but something else, something that seemed to exist in shades of gray and silver. Lee felt a combination of fear and fascination as she observed the phenomenon. She had seen many strange things during her years with the Navajo tribal police, but nothing quite like this. As she watched, the opening seemed to widen, and she could see movement within shadowy figures that seemed to beckon to her from the other side. Just as Lee felt herself being drawn toward the opening, her radio suddenly came to life with the voice of the dispatcher, calling her name and asking for her status. The sound seemed to break whatever influence had been exerted by the opening, and it immediately began to collapse, folding in on itself until it disappeared with a sound like rushing wind. The symbols on the rock face faded until they were barely visible, and the humming sound ceased. When backup arrived 5 minutes later, they found only Lee and the abandoned SUV. The tracks she had followed were no longer visible, and there was no evidence of the symbols or the opening she had witnessed. The owner of the vehicle was never found, despite an extensive search that continued for several days. The official report described a possible missing person and noted the unusual tracks found at the scene. It made no mention of the symbols, the opening in the rock face, or the figures Lee had seen on the other side. To include such details would have invited questions that had no answers within the framework of conventional law enforcement. The case remains open in the Navajo tribal police files, categorized as missing person, circumstances unknown. The vehicle was eventually released to the family, who sold it without comment. Lee continued her service with the department, though she found herself increasingly drawn to cases that involved unusual phenomena, as if seeking understanding of what she had experienced at the base of the West Mitten Butte. Now a sergeant with the Navajo tribal police, Lee occasionally patrols the areas around Monument Valley. She has never again seen anything like the opening in the rock face or the symbols that seem to pulse with an inner light, though she sometimes hears reports from other officers or community members about strange lights and unusual occurrences near the buttes. Each time, she remembers the brief glimpse she had of another reality and the question that continues to haunt her. What happened to the person whose tracks she followed into the desert that night? And what other mysteries might the ancient landscape hold? The American landscape remains vast and unknowable, but nowhere more so than within the boundaries of the Navajo Nation. Here, across 27,000 square miles of high desert, red rock formations, and sacred mountains, the veil between worlds grows thin, allowing glimpses of phenomena that defy conventional explanation. For the Navajo tribal police officers tasked with patrolling this land, such encounters are not the stuff of fiction, but documented realities that challenge their training and stretch their understanding of what is possible. The 7 cases we've explored tonight represent only a fraction of the unusual incidents recorded in official police files across the reservation. They speak of encounters with entities that move with impossible speed and grace, of lights that dance in the night sky with patterns that defy aerodynamic principles, of openings in solid rock that reveal landscapes beyond human perception. Each account is verified, documented, and retold in the words of those who experience them. Sworn officers who found themselves facing something beyond their training and experience. What connects these disparate incidents is not just their geographical location, but their resistance to conventional explanation. In each case, the physical evidence is either absent or inexplicable footprints that lead nowhere, symbols that appear and disappear, openings in solid rock that close without a trace. The witnesses are credible trained observers accustomed to documenting unusual phenomena with objectivity and precision. Yet what they describe exists beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience, suggesting forces or intelligences that operate according to principles we do not yet understand. The Navajo people have long spoken of such phenomena, not as supernatural occurrences, but as natural aspects of a world that is more complex and mysterious than Western science typically acknowledges. In their traditional worldview, the universe is populated by beings that exist between worlds, spirits that can take physical form, entities that can pass through solid matter, forces that can bend the normal rules of space and time. For the Navajo tribal police officers who are members of the tribe, such beliefs are not folklore but cultural knowledge that informs their understanding of the unusual phenomena they sometimes encounter. What is perhaps most striking about these cases is the consistent pattern of official response documentation without explanation, acknowledgement without investigation, acceptance without understanding. The Navajo tribal police, like many law enforcement agencies that encounter unexplained phenomena, have developed a pragmatic approach to such incidents. They document what can be observed, note what cannot be explained, and categorize the reports in ways that do not challenge the boundaries of conventional law enforcement, while still preserving the integrity of the witnesses' experiences. This approach reflects a deeper wisdom that recognizes the limits of human knowledge and the value of humility in the face of mystery. It acknowledges that there are aspects of reality that may forever remain beyond our comprehension. Forces that operate according to principles we have yet to discover. In the vast desert landscape of the Navajo Nation, where ancient traditions meet modern law enforcement, such mysteries are not just theoretical possibilities, but documented realities that continue to challenge our understanding of the world we inhabit. The stories we've shared tonight speak to the enduring power of mystery in a world that often seems to have been fully explored and explained. They remind us that despite our technological advances and scientific knowledge, there remain phenomena that defy our understanding, experiences that transcend our categories, and encounters that suggest we are not alone in the universe. Not necessarily in the way popular culture imagines, but in ways that are perhaps more strange and wonderful than we can conceive. For the Navajo tribal police officers who patrol the vast desert landscape, these encounters are part of their professional reality, woven into the fabric of their daily responsibilities. They approach such phenomena with a combination of professional caution and cultural respect, recognizing that some things are better observed from a distance. Some mysteries are best left undisturbed, and some aspects of reality may forever remain beyond human comprehension. If you or someone you know has a true story to share, leave it in the comments below. Our understanding of these phenomena grows with each documented account, each verified testimony, each careful observation. Together, we may begin to piece together a picture of reality that is more complex, more mysterious, and perhaps more meaningful than we currently imagine. Thank you for watching Sleepless Campfire. Until next time, stay safe out there.